All right. Well, thanks for being here, being part of the conversation. I'm looking forward to it. Just to recap a little bit, remind ourselves where we're at. We're getting towards the back end, towards the end of a series where we've been looking at Genesis 1 through 11, so the first book in the Bible, and these first 11 chapters that include the account of creation and the flood and the division of nations and all of that. It's offered as a kind of a picture of what all humanity holds in common. Okay, and so it's, in a way, it's the closest that we have in the Bible to something like an account of human nature, a treatise on human nature. It's before we get to kind of the choice of this particular people of Israel, we have this account of what all of humanity holds in common. Now, the way I've been doing this is we're reading these stories philosophically, and part of what I'm doing here is I'm kind of exploring a thesis. I have this idea that as this kind of lays out what we all have in common, that when you read a series of stories that depict what we all have in common, the earlier ones describe what's deepest, what's most foundational, what you can count on being there, whether you like it or not, right? And then as you move further in the story, what comes after is, as it were, more surface, okay? These are things that are more optional. These are the elements that perhaps also emerge later in a life cycle, okay? So the stories that we get at the very beginning depict things about humanity that are there kind of at the core and from the very beginning, and the things that we're getting to now later in the chapters are things that maybe we become aware of later in life, okay? Now, part of what you'll notice if you've been going through this and kind of reading this together with us is that before the flood, it's all individuals, okay? God interacts with particular persons, and it's always this kind of one-on-one between God and whoever. And with the flood, there's a shift to dealing with families and then clans, nations, empire, right? And so you get larger and larger groups coming after the flood. And you see this, it's signaled in a number of ways. In chapter 8, when they're exiting the ark, the animals even that we're told go in by pairs, they come out according to families, okay? It's like, huh. And then in chapter 9, God's been talking to Noah several times throughout this account, but in chapter 9, he begins to talk to Noah and his sons, okay? And so it shifts to now this kind of, this focus on families as the beginning of people groups. And I think what's going on here is something like this. At a certain stage in life and in our development, we begin to kind of have this emergent sense of social identity. We begin to recognize the fact that it's kind of loud. I'm going to take a sip here for a second and let her finish. Okay. We begin to notice that, so look, humanity's sticky in a way. We enter life within relationships that are there before we arrive. We don't choose them. We find ourselves in the middle of them. And then at a certain point, we become, as it were, aware that the particular family I'm in is not exactly the same as the one that other people are in, right? And then there's this kind of process of something like peripheral vision, right? Where socially we become more and more aware that there's other groups out there and they don't all do things in the same way, right? So this is something, we're not born with, but we become aware and we begin to situate ourselves within, kind of concentric circles, so to speak, of larger groupings. Now, developmentally, this only happens as we begin to venture out from our own home, right? As we start getting together with friends and we're in other people's houses, or we go on a trip somewhere, we notice things. It's like, oh, my family uses forks. At my friend's house, it's flatbread and hams, that we eat with. It's things like this that then start to build up, and we become more and more aware of the differences out there. Now, this kind of social identity element to human life, first of all, it's universal. Like everybody, has some family, some kind of extended grouping, some nation and or empire that they find themselves within. And there's different ways of thinking through that and how that is supposed to be played out, okay? So in Genesis 10 and 11, we get kind of two accounts of the origins of the nations and of these larger kind of social identity political groupings that we find in the world. Now, one of the reasons that we have both chapter 10 and chapter 11 is that they give very different pictures of the beginnings of the division and the scattering of the nations, this kind of multiplicity of people groups, of cultures that we live in. And we've pointed out already, if you go back to our early sessions in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, that most really important events in Scripture, we get more than one perspective on. It's like there's more in there than one story can kind of tell well. You need more than one story in order to gesture at everything that's in it. And so in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we have two different accounts of the creation of the world, creation of humanity. The first one is this kind of top-down, God speaks everything into existence. And then humanity is shown in terms of kind of this essence of agency, of dominion. But then there's Genesis 2. It's a bottom-up account, right? Where there's a particular kind of garden, a place that God then kind of takes some dirt and fashions a human being and puffs into it, and you get this bottom-up account, right? And they tell us different things. Similarly, I want to suggest that in Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, we get a kind of an analog to that. It's synoptic. There's two different kind of angles on the origin of the nations, and it's highlighting different things about these social groupings, okay, that we find ourselves within. Now, part of what we'll find as we do this is that, so there's two different accounts. The Genesis 10 is kind of bottom up. It's just the branching out of families as there's children born and so they migrate and move into other places and settle. So that's one story. The other one has to do with this kind of God intervening to scatter things in Genesis 11. But there's kind of a connection between the two in that in the middle of chapter 10, we get the story of a particular person who goes and sets up a kingdom, an empire of cities of sorts, in this place called Babel, okay, which then is the location where what goes on in Genesis chapter 11 takes place, okay? So there's a bit of like a nesting doll pattern there, right? So you get this kind of whole, and then you reach back and you pull out this bit about Nimrod and Babel and expound on that. Okay. Let's look into chapter 10 and this first account, and we'll go from there. I'm not going to read all of it. What you'll notice is that it's a long list of names. So I'll begin, and I'll read the first 5 verses, and then I'm going to kind of jump from bit to bit here to give you a sense of what's going on. Okay. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, the sons that were born to them, and sons that were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai and Yavin and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish and Kittim and Dodanim or Rodanim, depending on the variant there. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, each one according to its language, according to their families, into their nations. Okay, now what you get is this genealogy where all of, as it were, the 70 different nations, which is the traditional number for kind of all of the nations of the world, where they're separated out from this one family. From, you have Noah, 3 sons, and they all come from there, right? Now, the way in which it's narrated, so I wanted you to just have a flavor of it, right? It's name after name after name after name. That's important because it's going to be a big contrast when we go to Genesis 11. But you get these 3 sons, everything branches out from these 3. And part of what's significant about this is that it's not so much kind of holding land and space that is the important thing for this, but instead what you get are 3 groups that are distinguished more by their ways of life. Okay, it's more about kind of the cultural pattern of living that you get between these 3, and they go in reverse order. So it's announced as Shem, Ham, Japheth, but then they're kind of laid out. You get all of these genealogies, these family trees from Japheth and then Ham and then Shem. Now, I said that it's kind of ways of life, and basically what you get here is that Japheth is described as the one that's out of whom all of the seafaring people come. Okay, and then Ham is the one from whom all of those kind of settled peoples that engage in agriculture and build cities and have empire and keep slave populations, right, to run those empires. They all come from Ham. And then you have Shem, and he's the father of all the nomads, okay, all the nomadic people groups. Now, since we're here in Greece, it's worth actually noticing something here about Japheth and his line. So Yavan refers to Greece. Yeah?
Could I ask?
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've never heard this narrative like this. I've heard it like, oh yeah, Shem is like the Asians, Ham is like the Africans, and Japheth the Europeans. But like, I don't know, this way that you said it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a place it comes from, or like these interpretations, these different ones?
Yeah. So let me back up. One of the places that you get this kind of desire to localize it more has to do with a reading that arises a couple hundred years ago in the process of justifying the slave trade, right? And so what goes on there is they would want to say that Ham is basically Africa, and these are the ones that were cursed by Noah and so forth. The problem is that although you have some at the top of Africa, you have Babel. You basically have all of the great empires come out of this, and so the founder of Babylon and of Nineveh and Assyria and all of this, these are all from Ham. So it just doesn't line up that way.
There's also Semitic languages. Probably also from this.
Yeah, from the name Shem, right? Which actually means Shem. It's interesting. So you've got three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Shem, his name means name. That's just like the one with a name, okay? And then Ham, there's no particular meaning that I know of to it. But Japheth, in the text, it's connected with increase. It means to enlarge, right? Now, so Japheth, it's interesting that there's a bit of an overlap with Greek kind of antiquity here, and Iapetos, right? Who is son of Uranos and Gaia, right? And the father of Atlas, Prometheus, Epimetheus in Greek myth. And the name seems to be the same, okay? And Javan, then, or Javan, refers basically to the Ionian region. And what you get here, it's an interesting... so you have the sons of Japheth, which are laid out, and then Javan, or Yavan, in verse 4, we're told his son. So you get the next generation. And Elisha, it's uncertain, possibly Crete, possibly Cyprus. However, we have another that we know is Cyprus, which is Kittim, okay? So Elisha, possibly Crete, Tarshish, at least in Josephus' time, and a number of the rabbinic commentators put this at the Straits of Gibraltar in Spain, and probably at least Paul thought it was there. I'm guessing because we can chase that in another way. I won't go down that path right now. And then you get this pair, Kittim and Dodanim, or the Septuagint version is Rodanim. So Kittim is Cyprus, right? If it's Rodanim, this is referring to roads, Rhodos, right? If it's supposed to be Dodanim, this is probably the Danae, right? Which refers to the Greeks generally, right? So you have this, and part of what's interesting here is that as it lays these out in kind of different types of groupings here, so these were told very specifically, from these the coastlands are populated, and so these are the seafaring people. Now, I want to just point out that there's a kind of a refrain here in which, as he goes from one son and kind of the peoples that come from him, and you go to the next son, at the end of each of these branches, so to speak, of the family tree, you get a kind of a refrain, a chorus of the way in which these peoples are separated out. And so it happens in chapter 10, verse 5. Just read it, I'll read it again. From these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, according to its language, according to clan or family, into their nations. Okay? And then you get all of the descendants of Ham, the different nations that come from that. And then in verse 20, these are the sons of Ham, according to their clans, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Okay? And then you get all of the sons of Shem, which again line up with nomadic peoples. And in verses, I'll do 30 and 31 in this case. Now their settlement extended from Mishah as you go towards Sephar, the hill country of the east. Just point out, this is part of where you see that they're nomadic. They have a settlement. In other words, this mashab is it's a collection of tents. It's not something with walls and so forth, right? So you get these peoples. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. Okay, what's going on here? The first depiction that you get in Genesis 10 of the differentiation of people groups of nations, it focuses on ways of life, okay? But then those are kind of narrated as coming out of something like intrinsic principles within people groups, okay? And this refrain, it's interesting. There's one little variant here, but you get for Japheth or Yavin, right? It goes in this order. It goes land, language, clan, to make up a nation, right? But then these get reversed, and for Shem and Ham, it's clan, then language, and then land, place. Now, we're going to have to think about that, like why it crosses over in this particular case, okay? But before we do that, just want to point out that all of these things are, as it were, from within the people group. It's this kind of bottom up. There's no hint of, as it were, divine judgment, right? When you get to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel, God comes down and scatters them, and it's judgment based on things they're doing. Here, there's no hint of that. It's just kind of like God likes for there to be different ways of doing humanity, okay? He desires for there to be this multiplicity of peoples that do things, somewhat different from each other, right? And if you think about what goes into this, it seems like this is something that goes deep in any people group. Like cultures at some level, there's a certain fittedness to the land, right? In which they kind of come to be and adapt themselves to. Just for instance, I would go and spend time in the Netherlands when I was working on my graduate program. And part of what you notice in the Netherlands is the way in which they do things on time, whether you feel like it or not, stiff upper lip, you just make it happen, right? It's like clockwork, right? And at a certain point, you notice that this is a people that kind of, for centuries, have existed beneath sea level. And the only reason they can exist as a people, the reason there's any culture there, is because they have these dikes, these dams, keeping the sea out. And when it's time to fix the dike, you do it whether you feel like it or not, or you're not there the next day, sort of thing, right? And so there's a certain fittedness between the people and the territory, the land, right? My wife's from Wyoming, okay? Kind of high desert area. And it's interesting when she'll describe, she says, Wyoming is a dry place. And it's not just the land that's dry, it's the people are dry, right? There's something, and if you spend time there, there's something like that, right? So I don't know, there's a certain kind of fittedness between cultures and the geographies that they take shape in. And then language, you could think of this, so you've got kind of three things going on. You've got place, you've got language, or you could think about this as it's the ways we describe the world to ourselves, right? There's some things that are very difficult to put in a different language, right? And so there's language in a way gets to something of an inner world, right? Um, and then there's family, there's kinship. In other words, there's different ways of kind of ordering how we pass on life from generation to generation and how we trace that, how we think about it. So, I mean, one of the really basic things is you find societies that are more kind of matriarchal, where, you know, kind of mama rules things and you trace things back through whose mother, and then you have some that are more patriarchal, right? Now, and the Jews end up being ones that it's actually a matrilineal, right? Not exactly matriarchal, although that works its way into the stories a fair bit also. But you know, Rebecca seems to run things more than Isaac does, for instance, when you read through. But there's different ways in which, as you go from kind of culture to culture, in which families organized, and you trace who you're connected to, right? So these three seem to kind of go into that kind of broader peripheral awareness that we have of the kind of group that we live in. Now, it's interesting that in the case of Yavin, of the Greek people, that it starts with the place. It's like place, language, and then family grouping. And in the others, it's family, and then place, or then language, and then place. There's kind of a flip that takes place. And I'm wondering if that has to do, if that has to do with the fact of being a seafaring people, right? And that the Greeks from early on, it was more of kind of a cultural thing, right? You learn the language and then you become part of a polis and so forth. And these are in these settlements. And so it may be that the kinship element was relatively less than in places that were kind of settled, and everybody in a generation, you know, for multiple generations lived in the exact same place. Does that make sense? It's a thought. I don't have a sure answer on this, but it's something I'm noticing. So.
It also kind of makes sense for the nomadic people for them to be the clan first, because for them the land is like,
it comes and goes, right?
Area, but like they go to other places. They don't have like a specific place where they're staying. So it makes sense that first of all it's the clan, but maybe for the seafaring people it's a bit more like people from all kinds of families. Like you can also see how in many like historical port cities, people from all kinds of families were like gathering. Maybe. Yeah,
that's great, Louis. Yeah. So anyhow, it's interesting that you get this difference, but in all cases, kind of what makes up the nation is some complex of this, but it seems like the way it's told is to say that the center of gravity, it could go more on one or two of these than the other. Something like that, right? But all of these are going to be there as kind of intrinsic factors within the creation of a people group, okay? So I've been going back and forth between the word nation and the phrase people group, okay? Behind this is just, it's the goy, the goyim. And nation here, it doesn't have any connection. It doesn't mean something like a state. That's something that we need to kind of just clarify in our minds, is that what these are talking about are more like what we call cultural groupings or something like that, okay? All right. Now, so you get these intrinsic principles, and there's no, like I said, there's no sense in this of divine judgment. Now, let me kind of zoom in for just a second on this this figure in the middle of the genealogy of Ham, in verses 8 through 11. This guy named Nimrod, who the name means rebelliousness, okay, to be in rebellion, and he's the person behind the founding of Babel, according to this. So let's just read it, chapter 10, verses 8 through 12. Cush became the father of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, or in the face of the Lord. Therefore it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth Ir, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, and that is the great city. Okay. Now, we're told very little about him, but except that he founds these great kind of city empires. Nineveh and Babylon are the two great, before Persia in the ancient world, the two great kind of Mesopotamian empires. But he's described as being a mighty hunter and a builder. He builds, cities, kingdoms. Now, there is a rabbinic, way of telling this, that they identify the hunting that he does not with large game. It's not like, this guy really loves deer meat, but they connect it with slavery. That what he's hunting actually are humans. He's kind of tracking them down for slave. And part of the way they do that is by connecting it over with what's going on in chapter 11. That you have this city being built there, which is, we're told, Babel and so forth, is built with bricks. And bricks are always kind of a slave labor operation, okay? And so... That's a possibility. It's something that that could be implied in this by putting these two together. But however you read this, we're told that he's a mighty one, a gibor. And this is the same language that's used back in chapter 6, verse 4 for the Nephilim. So he's depicted as something as a throwback, right? So he's kind of trying to seize on to this kind of greatness that was the project of these fallen ones prior to the flood. Okay, so describing that in relation to chapter 11 is something like a nesting doll, right? So we have here in chapter 10 all of these names, and then in the middle of one of them we get this one we're told is the founder of Babel, and then we move over to chapter 11 and it's going to depict the beginnings of Babel, okay? But I want you to notice something as we move over. So let's go to chapter 11. And it's a little bit more interesting to read. I'll go ahead and read the first 9 verses here. But I want you to just notice on the front end that as we read through this, there is not a single name. Not a single name. Okay? Chapter 10 is nothing but names. Right? Here, not even one. Okay? It's as if it's trying to make it as impersonal as possible. Okay? And I think that's part of what's going on, because it starts with the whole earth, and so you have the whole earth gathered in one place, and then there's no names, it's just they do this, and then they talk to themselves as let us, and they, and they, and they, right? So it's as impersonal as possible, and something's going on here that we need to kind of ponder. Let's read it, and then we'll kind of come back and think through it together. Okay. So the whole earth used the same language and had a few words. And it came about that as they journeyed east, that they found in a plain in the land of Shinar, found a plain in the land of Shinar, and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly," or brick a brick and, and burn them, right? And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build up for ourselves a city, a tower whose top will reach into heaven. Let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." And you get the turning point here in verse 5. "And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of Adam had built. And the Lord said, Behold, they're one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. Now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Okay. So this it's a second account that, again, has the division, the separation of the nations as what comes out of it. But this time, instead of, as it were, these kind of intrinsic principles, that differentiate peoples, here there's this kind of impulse within humanity that receives a divine judgment that results in the scattering. Okay? And what's humanity focused on here? I mean, first of all, we'll just point out, it's obviously, we're supposed to think of this as all of humanity, because you have the whole earth and it's just they, right? So this is the people in the story here that are thoroughly nameless. They're opposed to something, and they're craving something. What are they opposed to? What did it say? So,
being scattered.
Yeah, that's right. They're opposed to spreading out, to as it were, being thinned out and not having their own place. And then what they crave is, let us make a name for it. We'll make a name for ourselves. Now, what that means is it's something like we remake ourselves in such a way that we're worthy of a name, something like that, where we can't be forgotten, right? And so if you think of that in terms of this kind of anonymity, right, in the way the story's told, you can ask the question, so why are there no names? Why is this like an utterly nameless account? Well, first level, I think there's several levels to this. First level is, there's a lot of irony, right? It's kind of like, oh, what's his name? His deepest craving in life was to be remembered, right? And so, the one thing they're aspiring for is to be big enough, impressive enough that nobody will be able to forget them, right? And they're just they, right? That's the end of those sorts of aspirations, okay? But you can go a little deeper, I think, than that as well. I think part of what's going on here is that as a counterpoint to these kind of intrinsic elements, excuse me, let me erase the top of this here. In counterpoint to these intrinsic elements of peoplehood, of being a people, you have this kind of impulse that, well, this is a bit redundant, but I'll just call it the Babel impulse. But it's hubris, right? And this is something that I think, by the way this is being told, we're supposed to think of this as something that's resident, as an option within every people group, every culture. Okay, so this one's happening in Babel, but any particular people group can activate this mindset, right? And one way you could think about this is if you dig deep enough into the folklore of any people group, you're going to find some set of stories about why we're so superior to the people that live on the other side of that river or just beyond that mountain range. Right? There's always that in any people group, right? Is this kind of, why we're the ascendant one or we ought to be on top, right? So I think kind of the second layer, like there's irony, but there's this second layer, which is to say that this is actually universal in the sense that all of the people groups that are named in chapter 10, this is a possibility for us, for all of us, no matter which ones we're a part of. This is something in us, okay? Or at least potentially in us. And then we can go down a little deeper still and notice that what's going on here, that this project of making this particular city, this particular people, something that is, impossible to miss, impossible to forget, so impressive, this kind of urban empire, what it does is it reduces the people within it to kind of faceless, nameless functions, right? And so this idea of we'll build the tower to keep us from spreading out, we'll build this tower to the heavens. Well, everybody in that city now is going to be a brick maker, a bricklayer. Everybody, everything moves to this one. There's only one end that you can have, right? Only one thing that's worthwhile once you start that. And so I think there's kind of layers to this anonymity, this namelessness in this account. Now, this Babel impulse, I want you to notice that there's, as it were, a vertical and a horizontal dimension to it, right? Horizontally, they do not want, they don't want to spread out, right? They want to reserve all of their resources, all their power in one place, right? I think you could think of this horizontal element as aiming at self-sufficiency. In other words, why don't you want to be scattered across the earth? Well, it's the same reason you don't want, so for instance, in the ancient world, if you have multiple children, well, first of all, only the sons get inheritances, but then among the sons, the first one, he gets, the double portion, right? Most of it goes there, and then you give lesser bits to the other sons. Why? The idea is that if it gets scattered out, then you don't have enough to have this strong base, right? And so there's this aim of autarkia, right? Of self-sufficiency that's there. Now, there's also a vertical dimension to this when they say, so how are we going to do this? How are we going to not be scattered? How are we going to keep all our resources together? Well, we'll build a tower that reaches the heavens, okay? And this, it works at a number of levels. So we'll have this one thing that we look up to. Just one thing, and we'll unify around this one thing that we're looking up to. But the one thing that we're looking up to is something that we're making ourselves, right? And we'll do this, as it were, by making use of our capacity of having the same speech, okay? The same language. That's part of what's going on in this. Now, a couple things about this. First of all, this kind of vertical reaching to the heavens, behind this account that we have in Genesis 10, you have some kind of other ancient accounts of this great tower in Babel, okay, or Babylon, which is built in torn down and rebuilt multiple times, but the particular one that it's a 7-step with the 8th being kind of the top of this temple, in their own language, they refer to it as the foundation of heaven and earth, or the gateway of heaven and earth. Okay, so you have this idea of having the place that will give, as it were, godlike powers to hold everything together. Okay, now, part of so one way you could think about it is something like this, that the horizontal one is about self-sufficiency, the vertical axis is about meaning. That's not going to write well. Let me, I'll write it down here, but is meaning. Now, let me just point something out. This kind of aim of building a city for self-sufficiency and for unification of meaning, this isn't the only place that you get this. When you read Aristotle's Politics, okay, on the front end of it, you have an analysis of the beginnings of cities that basically matches this. Okay, so individuals, you can't live alone because nature's, too hostile for that. So you have families, but they're not strong enough, so you gather families together into a village in order to survive. And then you have a collection of villages, because the villages you can't kind of have all the things you need. You might survive, but you can't live well. So you go from individual to family to villages, and then the collection of villages is called a polis. And now you don't just live, now you can live well, evzin, right? And so the goal of self-sufficiency is kind of viewed as what's behind having a city, okay? And then you go not much further on, and he kind of reflects on how humanity is, as it were, wired. It's a very modern metaphor. How we're fitted to living in cities. So political animals, in other words, city dwellers by nature. And what's behind that is that we have this capacity of reasoned speech, of logos, right? Logos. And so cities are the place where we can order our life in a self-sufficient manner around logos. Okay? So it's interesting. You have the same kind of original features here. In Aristotle, they're being celebrated. Here, it's kind of it's attached to this kind of hubris, this desire to not have any kind of dependence on God, but there's some overlap there. Okay, it's just interesting to notice. Now, another thing that's going on in this passage, just as you go from reading it in the flow from the beginning of Genesis, is that this is the first time that you have human beings exhorting each other to action. Okay? And so, come, let us make bricks, burn them through, burn them with fire, all that. And so they use the brick for stone and tar for mortar. And then come, let us build for ourselves a city, and let us make for ourselves a name. Now, you've had this kind of speech before, once, but not by human beings. Does that sound like anything? Come, let us. So Genesis 1, in verse 26, when God creates humanity, you get this kind of plural, let us make man in our image, humanity in our image, according to our likeness, and so forth, right? So there seems to be something here that has to do, that this exhortation implies synergy, right? Working together in some way. And the picture that we're given in Genesis 1 and 2 is that we're kind of designed for working together with God, others as well. But so we're created for synergy. But here it's something like this kind of urban empire impulse is we take this capacity for co-working that was supposed to be oriented primarily to God, or at least include God in that, and we make it now just how we interact with, to use with human beings and with our own, as it were, the products of our own labor, right? And so anyhow, it's an interesting element to this. Now, God sees this and he comes down, and this is now we finally get something approaching a name in verse 5, right? So the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of Adam had built, right? So we're, all the days, it's now just humanity, right? And here's something that's kind of interesting. So at the beginning of this section in chapter 11, verse 1, you have the whole earth. They use the same language, and you have this strange phrase. It's probably a few words. It's something like there's a simplicity in how they think through things, right? There's just a few words. Now, as they get into this building project, in verse 6, this gets repeated, but not completely. So the Lord, he comes down to look, and in verse 6, behold, they're one people, they all have the same language, but what you don't have here is and a few words. Okay? And so what they're doing, nothing will be impossible to them and so forth. It's something, it may imply something like this. Here's a thought, that as humans engage in this project of kind of creating a kind of a city, an empire, right? Trying to refuse to differentiate and move out and become kind of distinct people groups that don't swallow up others, but trying to make them all one. As it were, the more that we try to include into one, that requires us to bring in more and more kinds of speech, of thought, until that begins to actually lose meaning. Like the speech, the more people that are included, the less specificity of the language, until you get to the point where the language breaks apart. Okay? And so that's one way you could see what's going on here. Now, God intervenes very specifically here, but it also may be, as it were, something that's part of the process of what goes on when you try to homogenize people, to bring so many people together, is that the language stops working the way it was supposed to. Okay? Now, so we get kind of synoptic picture. You have an intrinsic picture in Genesis 10. You get this kind of option for empire, where we will not scatter, we'll be one people, and everybody will have one project, and it's driven by this desire to make a name for myself, right? And that's depicted as something, again, that's universal. So every culture has both of these elements. Let me gesture, it involves leaving this passage, but I want to say that in the broader biblical account, there's a sort of spiritual depth dimension to this division of the nations that you get in another place. And that's in Deuteronomy 32. Okay? And I want to throw that in before we open it up to dialogue here in just a second. So Deuteronomy 32, beginning in verse 7, and I'll go down through verse 12 to start with. Remember the days of old. So these are, by the way, this is Moses' last words before he dies and kind of on the edge of the land, right? So remember the days of old, Consider the years of all generations. Ask your father, he'll inform you. Your elders, they'll tell you. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, okay, so this is when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of, now, you may have sons of Israel. The Septuagint has the angels of God. You have, according to the number of the gods in some of them, and sons of God is probably the original. That's what you get in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So according to the number of the sons of God, right? The Lord's portion is his people, Jacob, the allotment of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land, in the howling wastes of a wilderness, encircled him, cared for him, guarded him as the pupil of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young. He spread his wings, caught them, carried them on his pinions. The Lord alone guided him, speaking of Jacob, and there was no foreign God with him. Okay? There's relevant stuff a little bit later on, but this is enough for the point we want to make, which is here you have this picture of this division of the nations as happening initially according to some number within the divine court. Okay, so the sons of God or something like, you have these beings, we would call them angels, that are created by God, but they're in the heavenlies, and that you have the nations assigned to different spiritual intermediaries at this point. But the Lord reserves a special direct relation without, as it were, an angelic mediary with Israel, with Jacob. Okay? But at some point, those that were the sons of God or angels of God in verse 8, by verse 12, have become foreign gods. Right? So there's some sort of distortion of that mediating relation that goes on, in which the sons of God become foreign gods, and as it were, start taking worship to themselves or something like that. So you get this kind of spiritual depth dimension or other element that comes in other accounts of this. But in Genesis 10 and 11, you get, as it were, these two elements as synoptic views on this kind of on the social nature of humanity, something like that. Okay, I think I'll stop there, and hopefully I've said enough things to provoke somebody to ask or have some questions, so we can do something interesting with this now.